Welcome back. So let's take a look at Aperture. But before we get into Aperture, the first thing that we're going to take a look at is the lens. And I'm going to kind of go over the different numbers and what is on the front of this lens so you have an idea of what you have and what it will do. Now this is a Nikon Afp lens, and this is for the DX format, which is a cropped sensor instead of a full frame sensor. Now the problem with this is you can't put a crop sensor lens on a full frame camera because the image circle in the back is not big enough. Basically it would vignette and wouldn't work. However, you can put a full frame lens on a cropped sensor, but you have to multiply your focal length usually by 1.5, 1.6, 1.7, something like that. So it becomes longer focal length. But in this case, it doesn't matter because this is just a crop sensor lens. This is the basic kit lens that just about anybody gets. We can tell this is a zoom lens because we have two numbers. This number is your focal length of your lens. So this is a wide angle to normal. So it's an 18 to 55 and the camera is always in millimeters. So wide angle is about 18 to 35 millimeters. Your normal lens would be a 50. Your telephoto would be about 70 to 200, and then 300 to 600 would be super telephoto. Now, the next number that we come up here is your aperture. So this is what's called a variable aperture, meaning it's not fixed. If this was a fixed aperture, we would only have one of these numbers. So what this means is when you are at 18 millimeters, your minimum aperture is 3.5. That's going to let the most amount of light in. When you are at 55, you can't shoot at 3.5. Your minimum aperture is going to be 5.6. A lens that is over a 2.8 is called a slow lens, not meaning that it takes slow pictures, just that it doesn't let a lot of light in. Most pro lenses are going to be 2.8 and below. The next thing that we have here is VR. VR stands for vibration reduction, meaning that this lens has image stabilization in it. Now, the next thing, but isn't in this lens, is a lot of lenses have internal motors. So as you get into your intermediate and pro lenses, you will notice that all those lenses have a motor just to drive the autofocus inside the lens versus the camera body turning the autofocus. And those lenses are going to focus a whole lot faster. The next thing that we have down here is for focusing distance. So this number right here is infinity, meaning that it will go from infinity down to a quarter of a meter. So that is the minimum focusing distance that you can get. And you can see right here, it's 0.82 feet. So you can use either a quarter of a meter or 0.82 feet. That's as close as you can get to focus. So if you were to get half a foot away, there's no way you're going to be able to get the camera into focus because all cameras have a minimum focusing distance. And the last little number we have right here is your filter number and also your lens cap size. So this uses a 55 millimeter lens cap and filter. So speaking of filters, let's go ahead and move on over to them and we will take a look at a filter. So one of the things that you're going to see in lenses a lot is a fixed aperture versus a variable aperture. Now I talked about it a few seconds ago and I just noticed that I actually wrote this wrong, but that's okay. We can overlook that. So a fixed aperture, as you have a zoom lens from 17 to 35, it's going to have a fixed aperture. So this is supposed to say 2.8, not 2-8, but that's okay. So what that means is at 17 millimeters, the minimum f-stop is 2.8, and at 35, it's still 2.8. So it's fixed. So as you zoom, the minimum aperture stays the same. You pay for that. Down here, we have the same 17 to 35 lens, but this is an f4 to 5.6, meaning that at 17 millimeters, it's going to be f4, and at 35 millimeters, it's going to be 5.6. So a lot of times you're going to hear information on fixed aperture versus variable aperture. This is obviously what people would want, but you're also going to pay for it. All right, and right here, you can see a filter. Now, this is a circular polarizing filter. And a circular polarizing filter is used for a couple of different reasons. One, that it can add a little bit more contrast to an image, but really its main feature is to get rid of reflections. Now it's called circular because the filter actually spins. For this to work, you need to focus, and then you spin this filter, and eventually those reflections will disappear, and that's when you have it in the right spot. Now there are a few different types of filters that you're going to be using on a digital camera. For film, there was quite a few different filters that you could use, but for digital, it's much more simplified. The first and most common filter is what's called a UV or ultraviolet filter. And a lot of these you'll see come free in kits. Now, all filters aren't created equally. You can get a filter that will cost you $3, or you can get yourself a filter that will cost $100. But what's important is you want to get a filter that matches your camera. So if you have a $2,000 lens, you don't want to put a $3 filter on it because you paid for superior optics, and you don't want to put a piece of plexiglass in front of your camera. Now, a filter does a couple different things. In the case of a UV filter, it blocks UV rays from getting into your camera. It also protects the front of your lens. If you were to drop your lens or something was to hit it or mud was to splash up, it would hit your filter and not your actual lens. It's a whole lot cheaper to replace a $50 to $100 filter than it is a $2,000 lens. So the next filter that I can think of that people are going to use is going to be this circular polarizing filter. Now the circular polarizing filter, once again, is going to be used mainly to remove reflections in things like water and windows. And the last one that I think is going to be sort of important is what's called a neutral density filter. And a neutral density blocks light from coming in the camera, and it's going to be dark. It's going to be anywhere from a light gray to a dark gray, depending on how much light it's blocking from getting into your camera. Neutral density filters are used a lot in filmmaking, and they can also be used a lot in photography. A lot of times when it's bright and sunny out and you are trying to sync a flash, the minimum aperture that you can get is going to be around f8 to f11. But a lot of times people don't want to take a portrait with that high of an aperture, so they can use a neutral density filter to block some of that light so they can reduce that number. The last thing I'm going to say about filters, there are a couple different types to get. When you are shooting with a wide angle lens, they make a slim filter. And this distance right here is going to be thinner. And the reason that they do that is for wide angle lens, you don't want it to vignette or the picture to hit off the end of the filter ring and ruin your image. So they make those a little bit thinner. Good filters are going to have a brass ring. The last thing I'm going to say about filters, and you can see down here, this is a multi-coated filter. If you ever look at the front of your lens, you'll notice that it has all these kind of funky color or coating on the front of the lens. The main thing that this is doing is for color correction. You're going to have a much better quality filter if it has this multi-coating on the front of the lens. The next thing we're going to take a look at is a lens hood. Now, I think a lens hood is actually more important than a filter because it does multiple things. A filter is great to protect your lens, but if you don't want to use a filter, a lens hood can really do the exact same thing. And the first thing a filter does is block light from hitting the front of your lens and creating weird lens rays on your images. I never use a lens without a lens hood. Now we see two different types of lens hoods here. This is for a fixed focal length lens, and most likely this is going to be more of a telephoto lens, but you can see it's just perfectly round and there's nothing to it. But here you see there's some little notches cut out. And you're typically going to see this in a wide angle lens. So when you are at 70 millimeters, it's not going to vignette on the edges. If you had this turned the other way, which is the wrong way, you would actually catch part of the lens hood out here on your image inside of a photo. So this is used for a zoom lens. So a zoom lens, you're typically going to see these little notches notched out of them. And one thing I will tell you is never buy a universal lens hood they just don't work good. A lot of times they screw on, and as you zoom, they twist and turn, and they just don't look right. You're almost always better getting the lens hood that's made for the lens. When you get cheap lenses, you're not going to get a lens hood supplied with your lens, but when you get premium or pro lenses, they're almost always going to have the lens hood included with the lens. So that's a little bit about lens hoods. They're a great option in photography because you can bang your lens up against something and there's no way it's going to hit. It's just going to damage or hit the front of this lens hood. It's not going to actually hit the glass and scratch it or ruin it. It keeps dust, light, and it's a great protector against the front end of your glass. So a lens hood is something that I absolutely love. All right, so let's take a look at Aperture. So we have Aperture, Iris, and f-stop. So let me tell you what the difference is between the three, because you're most likely, especially going to hear Aperture and f-stop a lot. Aperture is what we are doing. We are controlling the opening of the lens. The iris is the mechanism. So this that opens and closes is an iris. So it's an iris with these little blades that opens and closes that controls the amount of light entering the camera. Now, most likely you're not going to hear somebody say change the iris, but the iris is the mechanism that controls the amount of light. F-stop is the number associated with the size of the opening. A small f-stop is going to be a large opening, and a high f-stop is going to be a small opening. So most likely it's the opposite of what you would think it would be. 2.8 is going to let the most amount of light in, and f32 is going to let the least amount of light in. So aperture is kind of the process of letting or opening the lens to let the light in, and f-stop is the number associated with it. So let's go ahead and move on to a different slide here with a little bit more information. All right, so right here we've got some information on aperture. Now, naturally, when you are looking through your camera, it's going to be at your minimum aperture. Now, these are examples of whole stops. Before, in the last video, we talked about whole stops and third stops. And remember, as we do these videos, we're always going to be working in whole stops because it's simpler. What you're going to see is there are third stops in between these numbers, and you're going to see them when you're adjusting your camera. But for video's sake, we're just going to do these whole stops because it's much simpler. And each time you go to one of these numbers, it's doubling the amount of light that it lets in or doesn't let in. So as we go from here to here, it's letting in twice as much light. From here to here, it's twice as much light. Here to here, it's twice as much light. So when you deal on whole stops, it makes it really easy. So this is twice as much light, twice as much light. Okay? So that's how whole stops work. The numbers are 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, 22, and 32. So those are examples of whole stop numbers. Now, not all lenses are going to have f32, and not all lenses are going to have f2 or even f2.8. It just depends on your lens, what your minimum aperture is going to be and what your maximum aperture is going to be. Before, we talked about fixed and variable aperture lenses. Most pro lenses are fast lenses, meaning that the minimum aperture is going to be 2.8 or lower. So you're going to see fast lenses anywhere from 2.8 all the way down to 1.0, which would be a Noctilux, and it's a crazy expensive lens. I actually have a 50 millimeter 1.2, which is an extremely fast lens. A slow lens is anything from 4 and up, and they're usually going to be your more affordable lenses. So you're going to hear fast and slow, and that's what that has to do with. It actually has to do with how much light that it lets in. So faster lenses are going to let more light into the camera. Now, just like shutter speed, aperture has two functions. One, it controls the amount of light that enters the camera. Every function on the camera does that. They all control the amount of light that comes into the camera. So here it's going to let more light in, and here it's going to let less light in. Now, the second function of aperture is what we call depth of field. Here is going to be a shallow depth of field, and here is going to be a wide depth of field. Depth of field has to do with how much is in focus before and after the subject that you're focused on, front of and behind. Here, you're going to have a lot in focus, and here, you're not going to have anything in focus. So let's go ahead and take a look at some images that show depth of field. This image is of a landscape, and you can see everything from right here all the way to infinity is in focus. So this was most likely shot with a large aperture, meaning a high number, but a small opening, because that will give it a large depth of field. So this is shot maybe with like f16, maybe f22. So this is going to be a large depth of field. So this next image, you can see the flower's in focus and this little part's in focus, but it quickly goes out of focus to where almost completely out of focus. This would be called a shallow depth of field, and this would be shot with an f-stop with a really small number, so around f2.8. 2.8 is going to let a lot of light in, but it's going to have a shallow depth of field, meaning that what is in front and behind it is not going to be in focus. Now, there's actually two other factors that determine depth of field, and I have a specific video on it because we don't want to overcomplicate things for us. So I have a specific video on actually just depth of field, but this is what Aperture is doing. One of its aspects is controlling depth of field. And let's go back to that slide. So right here, remember the flower, this would be shot maybe around 2.8. That's going to give it a shallow depth of field, but let in a lot of light. And then we had the landscape where everything is in focus. That's going to let less light into the camera, but it's going to have a wider depth of field. So those are the two things that Aperture does for you in your camera. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave those below. And as always, don't forget to subscribe.